Welcome, everyone, to this briefing brought to you by the Israel Defense and Security Forum, IDSF. In Hebrew, our name is Abitchonistim. IDSF is the leading Israeli organization advocating for strong national security-oriented policies to guide the state of Israel. It's a great pleasure to be joined today by Yifa Segel, who is the managing director of Chetz for Israel, a nonprofit that connects world leaders, policymakers, opinion leaders, and change makers to influence the world for good and to advance Israel's national security. She's a research fellow at the Jerusalem Institute for Strategy and Security and the head of the Siegel Law and Strategy. Formerly, she was the chief of staff for Israel's ambassador to the U.S., founder and former CEO of the International Legal Forum, a proactive legal hub for lawyers, organizations, and activists from all over the world fighting against terror, anti-Semitism, and delegitimization of Israel and the Jewish people. Yifa, thank you so much for joining today.
Hi, Moshe. Thanks. Good to be back.
Absolutely. And of course, thank you to all of our viewers and supporters for tuning in. We have a lot to discuss, so let's jump in. We know that here in Israel, there's kind of this lull in terms of operations in Gaza, and we've been talking a lot about going into Rafah and kind of finishing the operations, but then nothing is happening, and there's all these discussions with the timing and the delays. What can you share with us about that?
Okay, so I think this is very, very important, right? I mean, we all understand that strategically, Rafah is the last stronghold, the large city still at the hands of Hamas, controlled by Hamas. We also believe that most, if not all, the hostages are there, and we believe that most, if not all, of Hamas's leaders that are in the Gaza Strip are there. And we also know that Rafah crossing has been utilized by Hamas to kind of smuggle all of their weapons and needed parts for weaponry throughout the year. So that makes Rafah very, very strategic. We also understand that even if one city remains standing after all of this, and just a few broken Hamas members, they can still declare victory as far as they're concerned. So that all of those reasons is what makes Rafah very, very important and strategic to both sides in terms of this war. So the question is, we've been very active in Gaza. We've been very successful, incredibly successful militarily in Gaza, and we've heard military experts talk about it. They're at awe and what was achieved by the IDF in this incredibly challenging circumstances. And yet, we're still seeing everybody, the IDF is still waiting to go into Rafah, even though everyone has declared on the Israeli side that this is something that is going to happen. So there are a few approaches to this that I can share with you. First is the thinking that we should hold off, right, because there is now negotiations over a possible deal for the hostages. And maybe if we now go into Rafah, then we might spoil it. We might make Hamas more angry. We might make the Qatari more angry, or the Egyptians. And of course, we believe the American administration is currently very reluctant to allow a massive operation in Gaza. They prefer a different way to go forward. They prefer to see, some ceasefire or a deal to release the hostages, of course. So that's approach number one. Let's wait with the operation in Rafah to see if we can get a deal, to see if we can get everyone on board, or at least less angry with us. A different approach to that would be if we go into Rafah sooner rather than later, then we might have more pressure to put on Hamas, and we might get actually a better deal and than we would otherwise get if we're waiting. Now, I just want to share a few more things for everyone to think about, right? Like, Ramadan is right around the corner. Everyone's talking about Ramadan, which possibly might complicate an operation in Rafah. And of course, the talks about a ceasefire that was supposed to happen through a possible hostages deal. So what is happening now? Because we're waiting not to go into Rafah, we're basically allowing those arguments about Ramadan to become more and more prominent in public opinion, in public discourse, even with policy makers, right? I mean, I personally believe that it's absurd because the massacre of October 7th happened on one of the most important, holiest days in Judaism, and no one cared to talk about that. So I don't really understand why, a holiday so sacred to Islam would stop us from finishing our operation for self-defense in the Gaza Strip. But I think also Hamas understands that this ceasefire that they were hoping for is actually de facto happening without their needing to sign any deal. Right? I mean, we're seeing this happening. We're seeing the pressure accumulating, and both sides understand that the more we are approaching Ramadan, it might be more difficult for the Israelis to launch an operation because of all that international pressure. And frankly, because I think there's a lot of misunderstanding within some Israelis about what that would actually mean. I mean, if you look at the history of Islamic forces, you'll see that a lot of their holy wars actually happened and were even launched on Ramadan. So it's not like they never fought a war during Ramadan, and there's absolutely a concern that things might escalate in terms of Israeli security concerns and needs during the months of Ramadan, not just in Gaza but also in Jerusalem and in Judea and Samaria, and perhaps inside Israel, God forbid, as well. So just to kind of summarize, there are two approaches. One is to say, let's try to be nice. Let's goodwill would go a long way here, and if we play on their goodwill, we might get a better deal and a better reputation in the international community, or at least with our allies, or these elements that are crucial. Some believe, like Qatar, for the negotiations. And the other approach, which I don't know if you could tell, Moshe, or not, but I support it fully, is the approach to say, no, it's the exact opposite. It's more pressure. It's setting, it's creating reality on the ground is what gives you leverage in any future deals. And it's harder to, for the Americans or anyone else to be critical of you, try to stop you from something that has already begun. So as far as I'm concerned, if we were already in Rafah, it would have been futile to discuss stopping in Ramadan, or even talking about Rafah as some kind of a possible red line, because it was already the reality. So just a short answer or long answer to your question about Rafah.
So speaking about Ramadan for a second, to clarify, is the concern that if the IDF goes through with it on Ramadan, that Hamas will use this as like a rallying cry for Muslims throughout the world, and therefore strategically there's reason not to attack? Or is it, you're saying there's a sensitivity to religions and therefore that's the reason? I mean, those are two different approaches about the concern with Ramadan.
So I think Hamas is doing everything in their power to incite the masses, regardless of what you do. I mean, these messages of, this is your opportunity to go up to Jerusalem, go up the Al-Aqsa Mosque, start the Intifada, rioting all over Israel, calling to Palestinians in Judea and Samaria, or to the Israeli Arabs here inside Israel to be active and take on jihad. It's already happening. I mean, you can see it already since the beginning of the war, obviously. But every time that there's an excuse, like now ahead of Ramadan, it's another excuse. But it hasn't changed. Their methodology hasn't changed. This is what they believe will save them and potentially be the ruin of the state of Israel. So anyone who thinks that if we don't do anything during the month of Ramadan, they will stop trying to incite against us, just doesn't understand what is happening in reality on the ground. And second of all, the people who are actually who have a better understanding of Islam and Arab culture understand what I told you before, that wars have been fought during the month of Ramadan. Even wars have even been launched on the month of Ramadan. People who believe in jihad believe this is a perfect time, for the religious fanatics are actually encouraged by this time of the year. So it has absolutely nothing to do, or not enough, let's say, to do religious sensitivity. I think that if you don't do what you need to do, what must be done, then you actually give power to the radicals, and I think that's what we're doing.
Now, this war in Gaza has kind of been defined by three stages. First, there was the Gaza City stage, and the Khan Yunis stage, and now the Rafah stage. But what I find so interesting is prior to October 7th or 8th, if you asked random Israelis on the street, can you identify the three parts of Gaza, so to speak? No one would have any idea what you're talking about. And likewise with the broader, American media. So how did we get into this situation where the IDF has compartmentalized and now needs to ask permission for each separate operation?
Well, the idea of dividing the Gaza Strip into two parts in the beginning was a brilliant military strategy. It wasn't the reality on the ground. Like the Gaza Strip is not really divided into these three parts. It was a part of what I believe to be a brilliant military strategy. So you had the northern part, and then we acted in the southern part. It's not really south, like center south, all the way down to Khan Yunis, and now we're at the verge of Rafah. And now the reality of Rafah being like a separate stage is just the fact that as a part of our military strategy, we wanted to evacuate as many Gazans as possible away from where the IDF is fighting and all the way to the south. Why to the south? Because first of all, it was very important militarily to start with the north, where you had the biggest, most important Hamas strongholds. And second of all, a lot of the humanitarian aid was coming through the Rafah crossing. And so to have the civilian population there would, just made sense. So that's how we got into this, like three parts in Gaza. But basically now you have, 1.4 more or less million Gazans that are all in the Rafah area, and that makes it a lot more complicated in terms of having to now evacuate them again into a new area that has been designated, by the way, by the military and the Israeli government. But it makes things a lot more complicated, and I think it was also an opportunity for a lot of people who wanted to see the military campaign stop, to use that as an excuse to try to stop it, or at least argue against it.
Right. It's almost as if the IDF has communicated too much information to the public, thereby allowing everyone to weigh in. In terms of that 1.4 million people, is there a clear plan of what to do with them, and has that already begun?
No, it hasn't begun. There is a clear plan. Some of it was discussed in the media. Some of it I know and can't discuss, and some of it I don't know. So generally speaking, the population would then move to an area close to the beach that was earmarked and designated as the next humanitarian safe zone. It will make things more complicated in a sense, in terms of getting humanitarian supplies into that place, but it was figured out already. Like there's a clear plan on how to do that. The only thing that is stopping us now is not the possibilities of doing that, or the understanding that we can do it and do it successfully, but just a decision from above. The government or the cabinet, the war cabinet, needs to say, okay, go. Just there's a green light for this, and unfortunately there are a lot of as we said in the beginning, a lot of different considerations that I believe the decision should have been, let's just start with this sooner rather than later. That's my opinion.
Right. And this de facto ceasefire, as you mentioned, which was not negotiated, but it is just happening because there's a standstill. Is it going to empower Hamas that when the operation begins, the IDF is going to find itself in a more challenging situation?
No, I don't think it's necessarily a problem militarily. I mean, maybe a little bit, but not really. I mean, we also have more time now to prepare, and so that's not militarily. That doesn't put us at a disadvantage. It does create a situation. I mean, the longer this war continues, there's a reason to fear that we won't be able to finish it because of international pressure, because of the Israeli public. Here we are a democracy after all, and people don't like wars and don't like killing and don't like our soldiers being on the ground for too long, and all these news of casualties and the hostages being kept more and more days in captivity. And so a lot of those factors can potentially play into the hands of Hamas and create some kind of a political war of attrition. And a political war of attrition does not play into the the Israeli into our favor, right? So I think they're counting on that. They're counting on the longer this continues, the harder it will be for us to to kind of launch that operation into Rafah or continue the war this way. Still, I mean, we also have a war happening in the north, and over 100,000 people that have left their homes 5 months ago, and there's no end in sight. So they understand that the clock is not so much in our favor. I just want to say, though, that they also have problems. I mean, let's not forget. I mean, the longer that this goes on, have more and more rebellion on their side. You see more and more of these demonstrations in Gaza from Gazans cursing Hamas, hating Hamas, demonstrating against Hamas because their lives are also impossible because of what Hamas created. So I'm not sure that their calculations are correct, but it is concerning. We have to take that into account.
Now, in terms of this drawn-out war in Gaza, you mentioned what it may or may not do for Hamas, but what does it do for Iran or for Qatar? How do they view these delays, and are they really the bigger enemy that we're completely forgetting about?
Oh, 100%. I think so. I mean, I think that Israel is currently in a war with Iran. Okay, so Hamas is a part of that war. I mean, it's the most active and bleed. It's bleeding the most out of the south. But we are in a war with Iran. We're in a war with Iran, and it manifests in different ways. Hamas, Islamic Jihad, the terrorism in Judea and Samaria, Hezbollah shooting at us from Lebanon. You have the militias from Iraq and Syria shooting at us. We have the Houthis firing at ships at the Red Sea. I mean, we are at an active war with Iran 100%. We are not saying it enough. And it's important, I think, that we say it every time, every chance we get, every time we talk about this war. It's not a war with Hamas. It's not, a small 2 million population in the Gaza Strip that we're actually fighting against. And also, I would like to say that it's not just Israel. It's also the United States of America, and every Western country in the world is currently in the middle of an active war with Iran. The fact that they don't want to admit it, that they're not communicating that to their to their own population is ridiculous. It has I believe political reasons for why they're not calling it what it is. But there is an active war. America, I mean, please don't forget, they have American troops and bases and infrastructure and ships and vessels and whatever have been fired by Iranian proxies or Iranian affiliated militias every day almost since the beginning of the war on October 7th, in Syria, in Iraq, in the Red Sea. And still they refuse to call it what it is.
In your kind of review of the Israeli media, because our viewers, our supporters who are tuning in, a majority of them are not in Israel. They're in the US, they're in Canada, the UK, Australia. So in your review of what's kind of happening in Israeli society, does your average Israeli on the street, does your average news reporter understand this is a war against Iran? Is Iran being spoken about? Or if you flip on the news, you open up the newspaper, you'll just see Hamas?
You'll see Hamas most of the time. I think, unfortunately, our media is not always, doesn't always do a very good job in communicating what needs to be communicated. Obviously, the biggest, most immediate crisis is the war in Hamas. It's an active war down south. And so they talk about it all the time. But no, I don't think they're doing a good enough job in framing it correctly. And personally, I do a lot of talks almost every day I speak to different groups here in Israel or on Zoom, like we're doing now. And when I speak to Israelis, I'm always surprised to see that when I talk about framing it as a war with Iran, you see faces that, they finally like, oh, right. I mean, like, we didn't think about it that way. We totally agree with you, but we didn't think about it this way until you said it. So I believe that no, we're not talking about it enough, but it's 100% true, and people start to understand that more and more.
Okay, so let me ask you a scary question. You understand this is a war against Iran. Many of our viewers understand. Do you think that the IDF and the government, where they're making these decisions in Gaza, they see the true enemy as being Iran, or are they very narrowly focused right now in Gaza to the detriment of what they could be doing against Iran?
No, I think 100%. I mean, they understand that it's a war against Iran. It's not a direct war currently. Israel and Iran hasn't fired on Israel. We have fired on Iranian forces in Syria and other places, but there's an understanding that the bigger enemy is Iran. It depends. I'm sure some IDF commanders, that their job, they're responsible for what is happening in Gaza. They don't need to worry about other enemies. But in the government, in the bigger ranks, the higher ranks of the IDF, there's a total understanding that Iran is the head of the octopus that needs to be that always needs to be on their minds.
So since the IDF went into Gaza, obviously Hamas's military capacity has been dramatically decreased. There's back and forth shooting with Hezbollah in the north, and Hezbollah slowly, there are components in southern Lebanon that are opening up. In terms of Iran's ability to wage a war against Israel or the West, are these significant losses that it's seeing in its proxies or allies, or do you think Iran is just as strong and emboldened as it was on October 6th, let's say?
That's a very, very good question. Look, if I was the Iranian, I would look at the world and say, you know what, these Westerners are as big of cowards that we thought, and maybe possibly more. Because I don't know if before October 7th, the Iranians were sure that they can fire continuously directly on American forces and get away with it. And not just one time or two times, like continuously for a few months. They have been firing on American forces, them directly or their proxies or whatever. We all know it's Iranian forces that are firing at Americans, and not just Americans. I mean, look at what has happened in the Red Sea. Look at what that did to the shipment of goods. This is a very big deal for America and a very big deal for the West, and that makes things and that really paints the Western alliance in a very bad way. And so that makes me very concerned as to how emboldened that makes the Iranians, because then what, if I was them, I would be like, what can I get away with next? Maybe I can do more and more and stretch the line more and more and more. Now, in terms of their proxy in Gaza, yeah, I'm sure they're not happy with it, and you can see that they're doing a lot to try to prevent it and stop it. Maybe they, God forbid, but it's still possible that they will succeed. And as far as Lebanon goes, I mean, if we can see that the Iranians and both the Iranians and Hezbollah don't necessarily want to escalate this into a full-on war. I mean, they can take casualties, and they can they whatever damage, doesn't matter. It doesn't work like a democratic country, as we all know. And as far as, again, at the end of this, they can stand up. They survive whatever is the rounds of hostilities is. They can say we won. And we've seen that pattern over and over again. So I don't think they're concerned about getting weaker in the north. That's not really what is happening, unfortunately.
Ifa, thank you for entertaining all of my questions. I want to switch gears and kind of zoom out right now. This war is being fought on many fronts. We have the military front, the diplomatic, the international legal, the media. outside of the military front, there is this sense that we're just not succeeding in the media. The diplomacy is not working out. There's the skepticism that Israel has any capacity to positively influence any of these other arenas. What are your thoughts on that?
Look, I think that the West has created a problem for itself by creating global democratic platforms and not understanding that the vast majority of the world's population is not democratic and is not an ally to the United States, and they do not share the values of the United States, and also that they would love to use these these opportunities to cynically exploit them against the United States and the Western Alliance, and that's exactly what they did. So we see that on college campuses, right? I mean, the fact that all these countries were able to fund American universities for such an insane amount of money for over the years and influence the education of young Americans, just exploiting those, again, democratic institutions and the democratic openings that they allow. Same goes for social media, right? I mean, if you guys don't know what AJ Plus is, right, that's a perfect example. You have AJ Plus is Al Jazeera, okay, masqueraded as a super woke, progressive news channel that exists only on social media. I think it's the most popular, or one of the most popular news outlets on social media that for Gen Zs and whatever young Americans, and they're brainwashing the minds and the hearts and minds of young Americans, again exploiting democratic platforms and values in to kind of cynically kind of infiltrate and change and indoctrinate American society into hating America and being anti-West. So I think that's a problem that it's time that the West wakes up and understands. Also, it's time for the West to wake up and understand that there is a new Cold War that might escalate and might maybe even already escalated beyond the Cold War, right? I mean, I think we are starting. It makes me more optimistic, right? The day that the West would face that truth and that problem and say, yes, this is where we are now, and we understand fully where Israel is. Israel is a true ally. Israel is a true part of this alliance, and this double game that was played against Israel throughout the last few decades will then have to stop. And so that is what is making me more optimistic. Also, the fact that there are so many of us now after October 7th that have waken up to see this reality for what it is. There are so many of us that are now active, more active than ever before, in Israel, in the Jewish diaspora, and also in around the Western world. I have more allies now than I've ever had. People that do security, that do media, that do law. The networks that we have grown exponentially. So there's a lot of reason for optimism. Look, it's a very big, heavy ship, right, that was going in a certain direction, anti-Israel, anti-Semitic, for a very long time. And it will take a lot of effort, but hopefully, in time, we'll start to see that shift, going in the right direction. And that's why I'm optimistic.
Amazing. It's great to hear your optimism. I know 100% that our viewers appreciate hearing this. And I'll tell you, if you have a project, a thought, an idea, a legal, international, diplomatic network you're trying to build, and you want to reach out to our audience, you have many, many people right now who are committed to trying to help out. So let us know, and we can absolutely try to get that message out there for you.
All right.
Yifa, thank you so much for joining, and thank you, of course, to all of our viewers and supporters for tuning in to this briefing. We will be back with you tomorrow, 10 a.m. Eastern Time, with Brigadier General Ari Singer, who's going to talk about the ultra-Orthodox draft issue that's becoming a hot topic. So join us tomorrow for that. Until then, everyone, stay safe, stay strong, take care.
Toda raba.